Good morning. My name is Beth Heel, and I'm the Director of HR Technology and Consulting at Diversified Employer Solutions. I'd like to welcome you this morning and thank you for joining today's webinar, How to Prepare and Communicate the Department of Labor's Overtime Changes. Before I turn over the mic to this morning's presenter, I wanted to go over a few items. First, everyone is currently muted in listen-only mode. This will help keep the webinar moving along and keep us to our designated end time of 9:15 a.m. If you have a question during the webinar, feel free to type it in the chat box along the right-hand side of your screen. We reserve some time at the end of the presentation to answer any questions you may have, and we'll also try to get back to within a week if we are not able to get to all questions. Now I'd like to introduce today's presenter, Tony Casolari from Paycor. Tony is a major market sales executive with Paycor. With that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Tony.
Yeah, good morning, team, and thank you all for joining today on terms of how to prepare and communicate the Department of Labor overtime changes to your employees with the changes going in effect from the Department of Labor. As Beth had mentioned, I work major market sales over here at Paycor and cover business sizes from 10 employees and above. So with that said, I want to go over a quick agenda of what we're going to be able to cover today. Introduction, of course, onto myself, which Beth kind of already alluded to. The Department of Labor changes, what that looks like currently today with the update, your options as the employer to do what's necessary to help stay within this law, 10 tips for communicating and 10 tips for communicating with your employees that are reclassified, and then questions and answers. So myself, Tony Casolari, that's my contact information below. I reside in the Chicagoland area and cover the southeast Wisconsin and northern Illinois areas and partner to Diversified Employer Solutions. So the Department of Labor changes, what's going on, what is it? So the Department of Labor has finalized a new overtime threshold salary level needed to qualify for white-collar exemption. So basically you're looking at any salaried employees between $23,600 to $47,476. If they work overtime, it is mandated by the government that you pay overtime for this. And essentially what's going to happen is if you have to pay overtime, it's literally time and a half for that employee. So this means that if you have a salaried exempt employee that earns under $47,476 per year, they're going to be affected by this uptake. So a lot of employers are taking action now to be proactive with the final rule going into place by December 2016. So just to continue off this, employees who are affected must pay overtime for the hours worked for those employees that are working more than 40 hours within this threshold for the salary ranges. And what this means under the proposal is that any salary exempt employee, of course, has to be paid additional hours for that overtime worked. You don't want to approximate your employees' hours. You want to make sure that everything's dead set, because this means that you could be just on a rough end, if you had 1 hour worked of overtime, an individual that made $40,000, $1,500 extra per year will go into the cost of paying this employee out. So here's a quick example of what this looks like too, as most of you might be familiar. This is an example of an employee named Bob. If his salary was $40,000 per year, but he works 50 hours per year, here's a rough calculation of what that would look like on his new approximate earnings based on the law with the overtime going into place. So it looks like roughly he'd be making now $55,000 a year, close to. So, your options as the employer. So what do you do and how do you handle this Department of Labor change that's gone into effect? So you have 3 different options to consider, and these were actually posed by the Department of Labor as well, and we just kind of simplified them for you within our presentation. The first thing you can do as the employer is to raise the salaries to the exemption threshold for your employees that are affected. The next piece would be reclassifying the affected employees, and you don't limit their overtime. And then the third piece of what you could do within this law is to reclassify and prohibit overtime without authorization. So now what I'm going to do is kind of take a look at these options that would be considered, or what you'd have to consider, and how that would look. So if we raise salaries to the exemption threshold, what would happen is, this is one of the easier conversations to have with these affected employees. Pursuing this option would most likely have a raise for this employee, and you'd have to take a look at who's affected. So if you had an individual that was making $42,000 a year as a salary, what you could do is just raise them to the over $47,000 and change for their salary. So that way you would not have the effect of paying them overtime, because they already would be over the threshold. So this is one of the easier options to consider, just to flat out raise all your employees up to the salary that would not have limits to overtime or paying the overtime. The next option would be reclassifying the affected employees, and no overtime limit. So what this means, again, just kind of how it says here too, is if you don't raise the affected employee's salary, you need to reclassify them as non-exempt. So it is a cost-neutral option, but a lot of the time that can also come with a conflict, because individuals like the exempt title, so it could be a situation where it's just a different conversation of their status within the company. So that's something to consider if you do this within handling their, it's a pride conversation, and most importantly, now you're going from exempt to non-exempt. So that's something to consider if you do go through this option. And then reclassifying affected employees with no overtime limit. If you choose this option, you have to make sure that you're really monitoring your overtime correctly. Just how it says here too, reclassifying the employees is not exempt, how to handle their workload, and you have to set a new hourly schedule and salary rate. So you have to monitor the overtime. You're going to be tracking this overtime yourselves. It's just that you're not really doing anything other than just just kind of working through these means here. And then reclassifying and prohibiting overtime without authorization. So with this option here, you'd reclassify the affected employees as non-exempt. You prohibit them from working overtime without authorization. You would reduce the hours worked by the employees, and then some of these employees would have to have their workload distributed to part-time workers. So this would be another option to handle the changes within the Department of Labor that are going on. And now what I wanted to talk to you guys about is the 10 tips for communicating with your reclassified employees, how this would look, and how the communication would flow in between. Some tips here include the following. But before you do this, you want to prepare. So employees, you need to make sure some of these bullet points below are addressed. Like we talked about earlier, the exempt position has a status symbol to it. So if you have an employee that's going to go from an exempt position to now be classified as non-exempt, a lot of the times it could be an ego conversation for them. So you have to handle that delicately in terms of how their status will be within the company. You have to have a plan. You have to have some kind of communication that's set up to make sure that this information flows nicely. And then by following some of the tips below that we're going to talk about here, it could ease the conversation up and just make this more fluid as this law goes into effect. So the first thing we want to do is you want to come prepared with the data. You need to understand your employees' hours worked, so you can actually show them where they're coming into within this law and how their salary is going to be affected. And you need to make sure that you're paying your reclassified workers on a fluctuating work week basis under certain circumstances. You want to make sure that you're meeting with the affected employees. You want to have a personal conversation with each employee to make sure that you cover your bases and leave no employee left undiscovering, trying to find out what's more going on with this law. For some smaller organizations, you want to have a consistent message for each employee. So with employee talk, everything kind of stays streamlined. for the larger organizations, you might want to educate your managers in delivering this news. It could help with a higher figure in the company, putting more of some help to this. And then, you may want to make sure that, there's another HR individual present, or just have an HR representative present with managers when delivering this information. I think most importantly, you want to be open and honest. It's a difficult conversation to have, but it's a conversation that you have to have. So, being transparent about the major changes and showing some of the bullet points of the law will help with the transition to let the employee know that this is something that is mandatory. It's hard to get away from, or you can't get away from it, and it has to be done. We're not trying to do this because of another certain scenario. You want to share the fact that the Department of Labor changes are also forcing you to review all jobs within your organization. So, it's not just their job that's being affected, it's multiple jobs within your company. And it's not on here, but they're going to be also, the Department of Labor, making changes and evaluating this every 3 years for the new threshold that the salary exemption comes into. And then, you want to set the tone for an effective conversation by just being plain honest with the employee all the time. So this is interesting. You could try the sandwich technique. So what the sandwich technique means is just, it's a common technique for delivering, difficult news, but, it keeps the conversation positive. You still need to be honest with your employee, but it talks more about the updates to their position and the reason for their classification. So it's just kind of more of a positive conversation to have with a positive twist on it versus just a negative twist that could come about by you're going to now be reclassified as an ex-employee, etc. You want to provide clear next steps. After you share this information with the employee, make sure that they have kind of a footprint of where they're headed within the organization, how this is going to affect them long term. You want to talk about when the changes will take place. So the final rule and mandate by the Department of Labor is December of 2016. So that's when everything will kind of be written in stone. And the reason why they did that is the Department of Labor wanted to give employers 6 months ahead of time notice to start having these conversations with the employees. You want to talk about the changes that would occur within their job if an employee is going up to obviously a higher salary. This is the reason why, and if the salary is now going to be monitored and they're going to be put onto an hourly rate just to conserve on overtime, you want to talk about that as well. And you want to have the signed forms available so you can make sure that everything's tracked legally and it's confirmed and between the employee and the employer. You want to have a feedback loop. So we've seen a lot of organizations do this quite a bit, especially with the new changes coming into place. So you want to have an HR representative that might be the individual, that might be that leader that's basically the point of contact for where all this information is going to funnel. But you want to have this channel where the employees and management can share feedback together on the changes that are being made. We talk again about being transparent and almost having an open door policy for your employees that are going to be affected, so they can just have that support they need with this change. And again, it's happening with all organizations across the U.S. So all companies are experiencing this. So what this would do is most likely help reduce that turnover ratio. If they went to another company, they'd still be affected the same way. Just guaranteeing them that this is something that's kind of set in stone here. We can't really do anything outside of the box, but here's what we're going to do to help support this and support you and your position in our organization because we value you as an employee. And weekly or monthly, at least have a touch base check-in point for changes that occur. Just like the ACA and some of the other pieces that have come through, there's always changes that are being made and updates to these laws, so you have to stay compliant. So, within checking the information on the SHRM website or just updates individually within organizations. I know our company, we do a lot of webinars, but it's important to stay tuned with the compliance pieces so you can stay tuned with your employees. I'd make it a habit to at least touch base with them weekly or at least monthly on the updates to the Department of Labor and other laws that are being affected that are having the employees being affected by these pieces. Signing policies is huge. So, you know, all your reclassified employees, you need to update their job descriptions, and then, you know, of course, have them sign information on their new job and what that job description looks like, especially with the individuals that are going from exempt to non-exempt, and you know, the individuals that are now going from salary $40,000 a year to now $47,500, let's say, salary a year. They didn't know what their new job description is, and all the bullet points that go with that. You know, acknowledge, have a receipt, store it, and have the policy signed. A lot of options, I'm sorry, I apologize, but a lot of organizations are looking at just plain out starting to track time. So if it's a manual process right now, some individuals are looking for, you know, time clocks. Some individuals are looking to automate this process, but whether you're doing it manually or automated, just make sure that you're tracking it correctly to make sure you stay within the overtime threshold. So, you know, some of the bullet points here talk about the affected employees, you know, needing to track their hours, making sure that they're accurate and correct. You have to prohibit the off the clock work, buddy punching, etc. that could go on, because you just don't want to be nicked by any extra overtime for this law. The other thing to consider too is the individuals that are working at home. So if you're an employee, how does that look? If you're doing if you're working after hours, after 5 p.m. and you're making $40,000 a year, that's technically considered overtime. So you have to have a strategy in place to see how we're going to track that time for individuals. Do you stop, limit the time that they can work from home, etc. And, you know, of course, the easiest way to track hours is through an electronic time solution, automating this process, time clocks, computer clock in, clock out. But, you know, it still could be done manually. It just has to have more of a finer touch and tune to it to make sure you stay accurate. You want to make sure that you're prioritizing. So, you know, if you're going to prohibit, I apologize, overtime, you know, without authorization, the affected employees, you know, they need to complete their tasks a few hours than before. So, you know, individuals that are working more than 40 hours, they have to start looking at how to get their work done within 40 hours or less. They just have to prioritize and calendarize their work days so they can work more efficiently. So this might include, you know, working with them to say, okay, here are the tasks right now that are in place. This is what's causing you to work overtime. How can we work a better plan and have more of those performance reviews done with them, or just having conversations with them to say, how can we better allocate your time so it works on more strategical initiatives versus, you know, the tactical things that are weighing you down. So, you know, having a plan for your day or having this discussed with the employee will help, you know, decrease these overtime hours that are occurring currently. You know, and last, you want to have a positive attitude with the employee as you're having this conversation. We see many organizations, you know, try to turn this into, with the sandwich technique, more of a positive conversation. You know, it's tough. You know, you're talking about, you know, changing job titles. You're talking about a bunch of things that are getting affected now for the employee with the law. So I think with multiple touch points, constantly of communicating the changes within the Department of Labor to your employees, just having that conversation, having just somebody as a central point of contact to talk to and bring feedback to is huge. You have to have that in place, because otherwise, you know, the employee would get this new piece of information, I think would honestly be lost with it. So we've seen organizations that haven't had plans like this in place in the last few months struggle to keep employee morale high, and quite honestly just try to keep their employees within the company. But the individuals that have actually taken the initiative to kind of set up a support, you know, line to them, whether it be an HR individual or somewhere where they can come and talk to and just, you know, vent and just discuss some of the options. This is important, and it's yielded more positive results for those companies that have done this. You know, make sure that, you know, these employees, some of these employees are counting on overtime. So you have to talk to them about, you know, why this is going into place. Quite honestly, if individuals were working if they were making $40,000 a year and now working and we're working overtime, if anything, this would be a positive, because if you are going to bring them up to the, the threshold, above the threshold of the 47,000 and change, they're going to get a salary increase, so you could spin it that way. Just talk to them and discuss what's going on and why this is happening, and explain their new pay structure, their benefits, and just have this in place, so it's just more of a smoother transition to their job at your location. So with that, guys, of course we're gonna talk about some questions here, but I want to provide additional resources. So, above, I want to give a few minutes here. These are some quick links that my company, or our company, Paycor, delivers to employers, clients, any organizations, and business partners for help in navigating the changes with the Department of Labor. So our first link here talks about the Department of Labor changes. So this is a good link to go to just to discuss, where Paycor discusses more of what's going on with the Department of Labor. The next thing we put in here is a Department of Labor calculator. So if you bookmark this link, what this will do is actually, it can calculate your employees' overtime for you. It just basically type in and click away, and then you have your answer right there for you. So this is something that a lot of organizations, business partners that we work with download quite a bit, because it's just an easy way to find out where the employee is falling. And then, the last step here is the Department of Labor. It's a 7-step guide that we've created to, monitor and work through these changes by the Department of Labor for the overtime guidelines. So you can download this brochure, which is a quick read, no more than a few pages, right off of our link right here to help navigate through the Department of Labor changes. And if you also go to www.paycor.com, that site, our site individually, also allows to research white papers and sign up for additional webinars that focus on compliance changes and, of course, Department of Labor changes. And, of course, our business partner, Diversified Employer Solutions, is a resource for you as well. So for questions, further information, of course, reach out to Beth, Director of HR, and Matt, Director of Strategic Solutions, where they can help navigate through the changes that are made with the Department of Labor and help you as a good individual. So with that, I want to turn it over to just questions the group has. If my partner Diversified wants to take over and have anything else that they would like to share, we'll go from there.
Thank you, Tony. On behalf of Diversified Employer Solutions, I'd like to thank you again for joining us today. I hope you found this information valuable. As Tony had said, it's important now to start analyzing on a company basis and also on an individual basis the impact that these DOL changes will have. The DOL calculator is a very helpful tool if you haven't started to do that already. The other important piece is to start tracking hours. Along with that, the 10 tips for communicating to your employees is important. We suggest that you start that earlier than later so that you can mitigate any of those difficult conversations or situations that might occur before the changes go into place. So with that, we're just quickly taking a look at any of the questions that have come in. One of the questions is, will you have a copy of these slides made available? Yes, we will be sending a recording of this webinar as well as the PowerPoint deck out to you with any questions that we may have received before we close out this session, and those will be available within a week's time. We'll also put a recording on our Diversified Insurance Solutions website under the videos in the library tab. I think there's one other question here. Can you recap what is included in wages? Overtime, commissions, bonus, Christmas gift checks, etc. Tony, are you able to take that question for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So as far as we know, it's overtime, and I'd have to check with the commissions, but I will give you guys an answer shortly, because I know that was still up in the air with the Department of Labor. They were making some updates there, but I will have an answer for you within the next few days for that piece as well. I just want to make sure we give that answer correctly.
Okay, with that, there doesn't look like there's any other questions, so we appreciate you joining us today, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.